The Off the Charts Football Podcast is brought to you by MyBookie. Believe it or not, the holidays are just around the corner, and while that means plenty of parties, gifts, and spending, it also means there's lots of football, basketball, and hockey games that you can score big on every day. Man up and play like the pros on game day. You can play the money line, side, or total. MyBookie is your hookup for all your betting needs, and it offers super fast payouts when you win. Remember, where you bet is just as important as who you're betting on. And if you want to make money betting on the games, you got to go to mybookie.ag. They have odds on every matchup, and their mobile site makes wagering on your smartphone a breeze. Here's the best part. Join now and MyBookie will match your deposit with a 50% bonus. Use promo code OFFTHECHARTS, that's one word, lowercase, off the charts, to activate the offer. Again, go to mybookie.ag today. Use the promo code OFFTHECHARTS. You play, you win, you get paid. Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian of Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Aaron, big changes for Off the Charts this week. We have a sponsor, we have a new audio connection, and we have excellent research by Alex Vigderman, Brian Reif, and Keegan Abdu to add to the show.
Yay! Audio working.
After our brief hiatus last week, we're back and we are stronger than ever before. And let's dive right into it and talk about two quarterbacks who are in their second year and have shown the improvement that you look for from year one to year two. Jared Goff and Carson Wentz, the number 1 and 2 picks in the draft last year. Both of them have been given more opportunities to make plays downfield in 2017, ranking 4th and 5th in the league in pass attempts of at least 15 yards downfield. And it's not just about opportunity. They're having success with it. Goff has yet to throw an interception on a pass attempt thrown at least 15 yards downfield in his admittedly short career. And Wentz is tied with, wait for it, Josh McCown for the league lead in touchdowns on deep passes with 9.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. Josh McCown has the highest DVOA rating in the league on deep passes, which is sort of remarkable. And the funny thing is, Goff and Wentz are not as stellar on DVOA on these deep passes as you might expect given their overall performance, but they're both so much better than last year that's just a huge step forward. Goff is 7th in DVOA on deep passes, and Wentz is 11th. So they're both still depending a lot on shorter passes as well, and a lot on yards after the catch. There's a lot of yards after the catch in both of those offenses. But the improvement and both the quality and the frequency of throwing downfield is remarkable on both these guys.
Yeah, Jared Goff last year obviously didn't have a great year, but the improvement on the offensive line, certainly the improvements in the offensive coaching staff there, and Todd Gurley putting himself in the MVP race, I think have really helped Jared Goff, and the numbers support it. Jared Goff is in the top 5 in yards and yards per attempt off play action passes this season. And that ties straight back into, I think, the way they've leveraged the use of their running back.
Yeah, it's a big part of the improvement of both of those teams. The Rams, of course, went to number 1 in DVOA this week, which seems insane given what we thought of teams before the season. It really is remarkable. I wrote about it today, this week at least, that this would be, if they continue at this level, this would be the biggest year-over-year improvement in DVOA in the 31 years for which we have data. And Philadelphia is number 3. Both teams are in the top 10 for all 3 units, offense, defense, and special teams. But we knew that the Philadelphia defense was good, and we knew that the Rams defense was likely to be great, and both of these teams were good in special teams last year. The difference has been the offenses, and primarily the difference has been the quarterbacks, although also for the Rams, Gurley has been much better this year. The offensive line has been much better this year.
So it sounds like you clearly think both teams deserve their records that they've had this far based on DVOA. Are you ready to predict that these teams, one of them could be in the Super Bowl this year?
Oh, I mean, there's no question that one of these teams is very likely to be in the Super Bowl this year. Right now, in our playoff scenarios, we have the Eagles representing the NFC in the Super Bowl 32% of the time, and the Rams 25% of the time. So over half the time, the NFC representative in the Super Bowl is one of these two teams, and a third of the time, the winner of the Super Bowl is one of these two teams. And neither one of them is really in a place where their record overstates how good the team has been. Maybe the Eagles a little bit, right? If I were to just look at the underlying facts, I would say the Eagles would more likely be 7-2 rather than 8-1, but that's not really a grand overstating of things.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And Wentz has just been unbelievable this year. Obviously, part of what he brings to the table is his scrambling ability. He's fourth in the NFL in rushing yards on scrambles, but he's also done an amazing job with Zach Ertz and the emergence of Nelson Aguilar. And I remember in week 1 when he performed well, we had a moment and we said, are we finally going to see Aguilar actually play impressively this year? And he's just been unbelievable this year. Both these guys do a lot of their work out of the slot, both Ertz and Aguilar. So Ertz will be splitting out from his typical tight end role. Aguilar, I think, came into the league and people thought he was going to be a deep threat, take the top off type guy, but he's actually had a lot more success kind of lining up inside, getting different matchups in there, and he's really taken to it and somehow been able to hold on to the ball, which we couldn't do last year. So out of the slot, out of players who have at least 40 targets when lined up in the slot, Ertz is 7th in yards per target with 8.3, and Aguilar is 2nd. Only T.Y. Hilton is ahead of him. He's got 10.6 yards per attempt. Really, really good numbers there out of the slot for Aguilar. As a result, Wentz leads the league in attempts, yards, and touchdowns to pass catchers who are lined up from a slot position.
I'll say one other thing, which is one guy to watch for, I think, in the Philly offense going forward is the rookie Mac Hollins. Was, I believe, a 5th round pick? No, a 4th round pick out of North Carolina. Torrey Smith has still not been completely what I think they wanted or what he was a couple years ago in Baltimore. He doesn't even have enough pass targets to make it onto our receiving rankings. And Hollins has been really good in limited targets, and obviously they like him a lot for the future because, he's the rookie. And I wouldn't be surprised to see more of Hollins rather than Torrey Smith as the other outside receiver opposite Jeffrey when we get later in the year.
Interesting. We'll keep an eye out for it. On the other side, from these great quarterbacks with youth playing well, is the Packers. And they've obviously lost your namesake, Aaron Rodgers,
I know. I miss the late days of the all Aaron backfield. We have only Jones and Ripkowski left.
Very, very sad. I know for all of you Aarons out there. That said, Brett Hundley is the guy right now, and Mike McCarthy said that he knows the system and he's the best man for the Packers' job to run the offense. But if that's his take, they might need to consider what they define as their offense, because he's got a league worst 3.9 air yards per completion right now. And that's just not going to get it done. That by itself isn't going to kill your team. Sam Bradford, for example, had only 4.6 air yards per completion last year, and he set a single-season completion percentage record, and the Vikings were a decent team. But what's exacerbating matters for Hundley is that on passes fewer than 5 yards downfield, he's ahead of only Matt Moore in yards per attempt with 3.4, and he's got 2 interceptions and no touchdowns on those passes. So more than half of his passes are less than 5 yards downfield, and you've got to be much more efficient with those passes if that's going to be a big part of your strategy.
Yeah, my first question about Hundley and the scheme they've been running with him for the last 2 weeks is, what on the earth have they been doing with this guy in training camp for 3 years? If they're not going to let him throw downfield, if they're going to manage him to this ridiculous extent, what's the point of a developmental quarterback if it's been 3 years and you can't develop the guy? On the other hand, I will say this, which is that Green Bay this week, over half the Packers' offensive plays hit our baseline for success. And that was 3rd in the league this week, behind only Dallas and New Orleans. And I know that sounds insane, and it's somewhat pumped up by the fourth quarter, but it was in the top 10 even before the fourth quarter. The problem was that on a lot of plays, Hundley would hit the baseline on 1st or 2nd down, or the running game. Aaron Jones would get the yardage you need to start moving the sticks. And then they would get to 3rd down, and Hundley couldn't do anything. 8 plays on 3rd or 4th down, Hundley went back to pass, and not a single one of them converted, right? So on 1st down, the passes actually ended up, I mean, for the whole game, this includes the fourth quarter, averaging 7.5 yards per pass. But like any time that a pass on first down was incomplete, anytime they didn't complete passes on first or second down, that was it. It was over. They couldn't do anything on third. And you've got to stretch the field with some deep passes, or else, all the defense has to do is just wait for the short stuff. And that means that if it's third and more than 3, all they have to do is let you complete a pass for a yard and then just
these strategies resulting in just no explosive plays, and it's only going to get more difficult for them with the injury they've had up front. I think out for the season now. Is that right? Is Bulaga?
Bulaga is now out for the year, and their offensive line has had guys moving in and out all year, and Ben Muth's been covering that in his column. But yeah, the loss of Bulaga is certainly a big one. But, I mean, they also have to decide, look, are they going to let this guy be the quarterback or not? Because this offense that they're running is just completely shackled.
Let's move forward and let's talk about running against a loaded box. So we all saw Adrian Peterson make the move to New Orleans and then from New Orleans pretty quickly earlier in the year. And since then, he has gotten a lot of carries, but he hasn't been able to get away from that loaded box. More than half of Adrian Peterson's carries have been against defenses with 8 guys or more in the box, which is the highest percentage in the league amongst players with at least 25 rushes. So Adrian Peterson up there above 50%, and the other guys in the top 5, Derrick Henry, Chris Ivory, Mike Gillislee, and Jordan Howard. So part of what's interesting going on here is that when these guys in the game, there's such a little threat of a passing attack that the defense is really loading up. So it's part respect for these running backs, and it's also part disrespect for what they bring in the other parts of the game. So the list of players is really interesting. Chris Ivory is a guy that I was in New Orleans, and I know the coaches were always afraid to put him in the game because it had to be either a handoff or a play action with him. You weren't going to ask him to pass protect or get out into a route. And I think when we look at, for example, Mike Gillislee with the Patriots, who everybody was excited to see up there, he's starting to get fewer carries because when he's on the field, teams know he's getting the ball. So you don't think of Brady as being a stack the box type of guy, but with Gillislee in the game, actually, they've been one-dimensional enough where that's been just what they are.
Yeah, I will say with Adrian Peterson, you're also seeing some of what you're seeing there is Drew Stanton, right? Like now that he's in Arizona, but now that Drew Stanton is the quarterback, why not? I mean, why not just stack the box against him all the time? Because, he's not, who's afraid of Drew Stanton, right? Nobody. But you're right. I mean, even last year, Gillislee only had 11 pass targets the entire year. So that is the problem with a player like that. That being said, I will point out that's also the problem with LeGarrette Blount, and that didn't really hurt the Patriots when they would bring in LeGarrette Blount when you knew they were going to run and he would get yardage anyway. So I think some of that is just that Gillislee just plays that same role. It's a goal line role. It's a fourth quarter role. He was never going to be, I guess, the guy in the first and second quarters because in the first and second quarters you need to have that, threat that you're going to possibly pass the ball. But when you're just running out the clock in the fourth quarter.
Right, he's got a different usage, a different role. And it reminds me last week with the Ajayi trade, a lot of people started asking me, why are the Eagles making this trade? They already have LeGarrette Blount. He's, amongst the league leaders in broken tackles. I think actually leading the league in broken tackles last time I checked, and broken tackle rate. So what's the idea behind that? Well, Ajayi is the only guy in the Eagles backfield now that can be on the field on all 3 downs and isn't going to be a big kind of tip-off guy when he's back there. So I think you're right on. I think it's about finding the right role for the guy and using the guys in concert with one another and not necessarily saying Mike Gillislee is bad, LeGarrette Blount is bad. They just have a little bit of a different usage, and they're very valuable in kind of the goal line, short yardage, and 4-minute offense situations.
Yeah, Howard is the other guy on that list, by the way, where it's quarterback related, right? I mean, given the offense they're running now with Trubisky, I would put like 11 guys in the box.
So what's interesting is Derrick Henry and Chris Ivory are both on the list, and they're both in backfields where they split a lot of the time. And I think it's very educational as to why those guys are kind of the number 2s, even though sometimes they look just as talented with the ball in their hands as the number 1 running backs on those teams. But it's DeMarco Murray and it's Leonard Fournette and their ability to do different things on passing downs that enhances their value.
Yeah. I think that it is important. Look, you want receivers of different types. You want to mix running backs. You also want of different types. That's why from the very beginning of Football Outsiders, I've always favored the idea of running back by committee. And it's good to have guys who do different things because you need to have that flexibility. But yeah, a lot of times you want to make sure you don't have a guy out on the field who tips everybody to what you're going to do.
All right, on that note, let's move into the most important games of the week. First up, the most important game of the week for playoff odds. What do you have, Aaron?
Well, the most important game of the week for playoff odds is Dallas at Atlanta, which is an interesting one because we don't exactly know who the Dallas Cowboys are going to have on the field this week. Dallas makes the playoffs 57% of the time with a win, 27% with a loss. Atlanta, 25% of the time with a win, but only 7% of the time with a loss. So it is really important, especially for the Falcons, to win this game. But will Ezekiel Elliott be there? By the time we put this podcast online, we will probably know the answer to that question. But right now, we don't. I think he will be because even if the court renews his suspension, my guess is they'll decide that Thursday is too late to put it in place for this week. But there's also the injuries to Terrence Williams and Dez Bryant, and the question about whether they're going to be playing for Dallas. That being said, do the Cowboys really even need them given the quality of the Falcons' defense this year? I mean, you want your best guys out there, but the Falcons' defense has been so poor this year. I don't see that it's impossible for Dallas to win this game if they're without those receivers.
I agree with you. The Falcons, kind of one of their weak points this year, we've spent a lot of time focusing on their offense and the issues compared to last season, but their run defense has really struggled. They're 29th in rush defense DVOA. And really interestingly, when you break it down in terms of defending against zone running offenses versus against power runs. So zone runs where you're not going to have pullers, kind of more of a space-oriented blocking scheme, whereas against a power scheme, it's going to be man blocking with a puller coming around and often a fullback running downhill. The Falcons are around league average defending the zone, but against power, they're really struggling, allowing 3.2 yards per carry and over 3 yards per attempt both before and after contact on those plays. Now, the Cowboys, so that's really been what's hurt them. They've been about average zoning against zone runs. Now, the Cowboys, they tend to run a relatively balanced attack, 16th in zone attempts, 19th in power attempts. But when they run power, they've been really successful, especially in terms of yards after contact, which goes back to Ezekiel Elliott and his downfield running ability. So they average 6.5 yards per carry on power runs, which is 4th in the NFL. And 4.5 of those yards are coming after contact, which leads the league. So they have the 7th biggest difference in power efficiency versus zone efficiency. Most teams are more effective on power than zone in general, but they have a 2.6 yard split. And that's mainly because of their yards after contact when they're coming with these zone schemes. So I look at this as sort of a strength against weakness that, like you said, they don't need Terrence Williams to give the ball to Ezekiel Elliott and run downhill. What they do need is Ezekiel Elliott.
Right, and their offensive line, but the offensive line is in fine shape right now. I think it's also interesting to look at the DVOA versus types of receivers. Atlanta is is number 32 in the league against number 2 receivers, but they're 3rd against number 3 receivers. It's very different from last year when they were very poor against slot receivers. And if you look at the cornerback charting numbers, Brian Poole has been a lot better this year. But the charting stats, at least, are kind of similar for Robert Alford, Brian Poole, and Desmond Trufant. The difference, of course, being Trufant faces fewer targets because quarterbacks know that he's good, right? It's not all about success rate and yards allowed per pass for cornerbacks. It's also about how often they're targeted, because often a good cornerback may not have the best rate stats because you're only throwing at him because you know the guy's open and otherwise you're avoiding him. Anyway, I think even if Terrence Williams and Dez Bryant are injured, especially if only one of them is injured and the other one is not, Bryce Butler, he's the deep threat. And we talked, I think, last week we ended up having the audio problem. So people missed me talking last week about how Dak Prescott is not throwing the ball downfield as much as he did last year. But the guy he does throw downfield to is Bryce Butler. So if Butler is in the game, I think with either Dez or Williams, even if one of those guys misses the games, I think you could see a huge game for Bryce Butler in that number 2 slot because the Falcons have given up a lot more stuff to the number 2 guy, whereas Cole Beasley in the slot, Poole's had a better year this year, probably has him covered.
Yeah, and just to support what you were saying before about the targets, Alford and Trufant. Alford 292 pass snaps this year. Trufant 287 pass snaps this year. But Alford's been targeted 45 times with Trufant just 32. So absolutely right on there.
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting, I think, to flip it to Atlanta on offense and Dallas on defense is the Cowboys have much more pass rush than people give them credit for, or than I even realized. They are 10th in adjusted sack rate, and they are 5th in pressure rate. And for a large part of the year, that was one guy. That was DeMarcus Lawrence. But now it's 2 guys because David Irving has been activated and has played very well over the last few weeks. And I think that is going to be a bit of a problem for the Atlanta offense, which has been very good this year, but not as good as last year. I mean, the real reason why Atlanta looks on offense like they're not as good is that they have the worst average starting field position in the league. That's not really Matt Ryan's fault, but they still have gone from otherworldly last year to still just very good this year. And since the Cowboys offense is also very good, it's not really a big advantage for the Falcons or anything like that.
I would also say, and it's not as simple as just give the ball to Devontae Freeman and Julio Jones, but Kyle Shanahan found a way to do that, I think, much more effectively last year. And I think that's definitely taken them from otherworldly back down to just being good, like you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people have – it's interesting. If you look at like the splits of how often they throw to each receiver and run pass splits, it doesn't look different from the offense that Shanahan run. But I think when you read the Atlanta fans who do analysis, when you listen to like what Charles McDonald says, the route combinations are different, and they're just not getting guys open.
Yeah, well, that's been for sure. Okay, let's move forward and take a look at the most important game of the week for Super Bowl odds. That's which teams will have the most impact on their likelihood of making the Super Bowl based on this week's games. And what is that?
Well, there are not really any games this week that have a huge impact on Super Bowl odds for both teams. So the game with the most impact is the Los Angeles Chargers at Jacksonville. That's because Jacksonville makes the Super Bowl 26.2% of the time with a win, but only 16.8% of the time with a loss. The Chargers, the difference is very small. It's like 0.1% with a loss, 0.4% with a win. But the important thing here is that the AFC South is currently the only tied division race. So the games involving those AFC South teams are important. I mean, the second most important game for playoff position is Cincinnati, Tennessee. So it's Jacksonville is obviously another surprise team like the Rams, but because they're 5-3, they're really behind in the playoff seeding race. The odds are strong that they'll have to go on the road to face Kansas City, Pittsburgh, or New England. And the way to avoid that is to win more games. So they need to win this game against the mildly frisky Chargers.
All right, I'm going to come out and just say it. This one, it doesn't pass my smell test. The Jaguars, if they win this game, they would have a 26% chance of making the Super Bowl. I just can't believe it with Blake Bortles' team. We were having a discussion last night about scouting quarterbacks and how there's kind of 4 real tiers of quarterbacks. It's guys that you win because of, guys that you win with, guys that you win in spite of, and guys that you can't win with. And the question about Blake Bortles came up, and what is he? What kind of guy is he? And right now this year, he's playing like a you can win in spite of type of quarterback. You can find ways to win the game. Trent Dilfer being the ultimate example of a win in spite of type of quarterback. But I don't see it. I don't think if they do get to the playoffs and if they do advance, which I'm hard pressed, I think a team at that point in the year is going to say, you have to beat us with Blake Bortles. And I think he's a can't win with guy. I don't think he's going to be able to do that when called upon. So
I think he's Trent Dilfer. Because Tampa Bay is the best pass defense we've ever measured, 2002. Jacksonville this year, right now, is the 3rd best pass defense we've ever measured. So all he has to be is.
And I don't think he can.
I know it's shocking. It's shocking that he's been slightly above average this year, and I agree with you. He's not really right. He's really not an above average quarterback. But they've managed that offense. Look, I agree with you. Look, here's the problem, right? What happens if they go out there and they go down big? And all of a sudden you can't use Fournette. And all of a sudden it doesn't matter how good your pass defense is because the other team is running the ball down your throat and your run defense
31st
is good, right?
in what run defense DVOA.
Jacksonville gives up a kickoff return touchdown to start the game, and then they blow one long play. And all of a sudden they're down 14-0. I agree with you then. That's a problem. But that's why these are playoff odds and not playoff certainties. I know it's crazy to think of Jacksonville as having an opportunity that good, but that defense is so good against the pass, and there's no great team in the AFC that's where we have them at. We have them winning the conference. Look, I mean, I think subjectively we all feel that the DVOA is underrating the Patriots, that we think the Patriots are going to get their act together a little more on defense, right? But even if we think the Patriots are more likely to make the Super Bowl than Jacksonville, that still makes Jacksonville the third most likely team in the AFC to make it. That pass defense is that good.
Really unbelievable. And I can see why it made AJ Green just want to get the chokehold there around Jalen Ramsey.
I'll say something else, which is this game specifically is totally set up for Jacksonville to win because the Chargers are a strong pass defense and a strong passing offense, but a poor run defense and a poor run offense. So if you think of it as the offense tends to dictate to the defense how it wants to play, on offense, Jacksonville's going to want to run the ball. Well, guess what? The Chargers can't stop Fournette. But on the other side, the Chargers are going to want to pass the ball. But the Jaguars will shut that down entirely. So they're going to have Melvin Gordon have a huge game. And he can, but it's just not a really good matchup for the Chargers.
Yeah, matchup-wise, I definitely see what you're saying there. One more note on the Jaguars. So we mentioned their 31st ranked rush defense. And what's really interesting there is breaking out their yards before contact allowed versus the yards after contact allowed. And they're really getting bullied at the line of scrimmage while actually doing an okay job at the second level. So they're allowing 2.79 yards before first contact. That's the second most in the league. And they're 2.5 standard deviations above the league average. So league average is 1.5 yards allowed before contact. They're allowing 2.8. On the second level, they actually have the second lowest yards after contact per attempt on all runs, but they have the lowest yards after contact percentage as a percentage of total yards, but they're allowing a lot before contact, and that comes down to push at the line of scrimmage that's actually going on. Meanwhile, on the other side of the equation, big surprise, just because I went down this rabbit hole, the Browns are actually first in the rush defense DVOA, and going into that is how good they've been at the line of scrimmage. So they're on the opposite side of the Jaguars, and they have the lowest yards per attempt in the league with 2.93, and they're dominating at the line of scrimmage with only 0.55 yards before first contact. Next closest team is the Panthers with 0.8, and the league average is 1.5. So they're doing an amazing job before contact. So for as much as we talk about yards after contact and breaking that out, we can learn more about the lines by talking about yards before contact and adjusted line rate and these sorts of statistics. And that breakdown tells you something interesting about how the Browns and Jaguars have gone to such different places in terms of run defense DVOA.
So a little bit of an applause for players on the Browns who may not actually suck, Danny Shelton and Trevon Coley. That is the defensive tackles on the Cleveland Browns, who you do not hear a lot about. Shelton was a first-round pick in 2015, but they may not be terrible. There are players on that team that may not be terrible.
They've never been immune to having good players with, Joe Thomas and Alex Mack and Josh Gordon now making his return potentially. So
there may be players on that team that are not terrible and not injured and not on drugs.
You can always use more. On that note, we will sign off. A quick reminder that charting data and projections are for sale on footballoutsiders.com. Please subscribe to the podcast and rate us on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. And one more time, the MyBookie promo code is off the charts, one word. You can put in the promo code off the charts on mybookie.ag, and they will match your deposit with 50%. So go take advantage of that. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.